Welcome back. If you're just joining us again after a week or two off after having completed Part A, we're glad to have you back with us. And for those of you who are just plunging right ahead from Part A into Part B, we hope you took a little break so that you could stretch and get a snack and a little water before we start the next part of our journey together. Just to summarize what we covered in Part A, we looked at the introduction to social and emotional learning. We looked at some statistics that support why SEL is so important. And we talked about the types of learners that would benefit from social and emotional learning, which really is all types of students in your classroom. Social and emotional learning being the umbrella for all the practices that we're going to be covering. So then as we go into Part B for today, we want to start talking about the practices that promote social and emotional learning. For our first activity for Part B, we are going to be doing a sort of practices that promote social and emotional learning in your classroom. Many of these practices you already do. Your moderator will help you by distributing 10 practices that promote social and emotional learning. Your decision is to choose which 5 you really think help promote SEL in a classroom. So with your partner or with your group, prioritize and pick the 5 that you think really promote social and emotional learning. Have some conversation and discussion, and we'll meet back in a few minutes. Now that you've chosen your 5 and are probably wondering which ones are the winners, we're really going to look at those practices that help promote social and emotional learning in your classroom. So as we do that, let's break them into categories. The first ones have to do with our teacher interactions. And the first 2 that we're going to talk about are teacher language and warmth and support. Teacher language is critical for students in terms of hearing you model what type of language we should be using with each other, and behavior as well. They're looking for things that show that basis for social emotional skills within you as the teacher. In terms of warmth and support, we are looking for those connections that you make with your students. Much like we did with our introductory beach ball activity, we're looking for the connections that you make. Do you greet every student every day? Do you have personal comments for each student? Hey, I like your shirt. I saw your game yesterday. Oh my gosh, I heard you did so well on that test. Those comments that let students know that we are taking a personal interest in their lives, that lend to that warmth and support and that feeling of community in a classroom. That allows students to feel more closely bonded to you as well as to those students around them, building empathy and kindness and compassion in our community. The next section we want to look at is teacher planning. And the first part of teacher planning that really affects our SEL practice is balanced instruction. So I'm going to ask you to really take some time to think about how much time do you spend talking and how much time do your students spend talking. It is some of the most interesting observations that I've ever done are to just sit with a stopwatch and time how long the teacher talks and how long the students talk, and really reflect on who's actually doing the learning and who's doing the talking most of the time. Other things I'd like you to think about are the variety of modalities you have in your classroom. It doesn't matter what content area you teach, but we need to have some variety of hands-on, hands-off, listening, speaking, all of those combinations. For those students that need more active learning, can they do sorts? Can they walk around the room to take notes instead of sitting at a desk? Do you have flexible seating options for them so that they can meet their own needs? Can they stand at a music stand or sit on a yoga ball or just choose to sit somewhere else for a different perspective on the classroom for that day? The last part of that balanced instruction piece would also be, do we allow students to work alone occasionally, but also to work in groups occasionally? Are the groups always chosen by you, or can they choose their own partners and make some good decisions once in a while on who they want to work with? We really want to look at the classroom as a whole and determine if both you and your students are equal partners in this learning process. The more onus we put on our students in the classroom, the more we will see them buy into the content that they're learning, academic achievement go up, but even more importantly, the basis for those social emotional skills gets strengthened. Our second piece of teacher planning that we want to talk about is true cooperative learning. And cooperative learning goes back decades in terms of research and the pieces that actually exist. And cooperative learning goes far beyond just working in groups, which we talked about previously. True cooperative learning has all 5 of these pieces. So we are looking at that positive interdependence so that if one student succeeds, we all succeed. And if one student is starting to struggle, we're all going to struggle in order to build them up. It also has to take into account individual accountability so that every person has a role that they must fulfill, every person has a task that they must accomplish so that no one is riding on the coattails of anybody else within the group. We are looking at group processing. So how often do your groups get the opportunity to sit after the task is done and really rate how well they work together? In industry, so many group teams have to actually go into a war room after they've accomplished some task and really figure out what they did well, what they didn't do well, how much money it may have cost them, and what they would do better the next time. How often do you really give students the time after they've completed a task to sit as a group and really figure out how well they did things? Not to just rip into each other and say, well, I did more than you did and you did the easy part, but to actually take some time to say, wow, we did this really well together, but we really dropped the ball here. If we were going to do it again, we would make it look a little bit differently. Perhaps we'd set deadlines, perhaps we'd have checkpoints for each other and things like that. It's important for students to start to learn what that group processing really should look like. Also involved in any cooperative learning activity is social skills development. So how well did you introduce the concepts of listening to your group members before you speak, of not interrupting each other, of making good eye contact with each other, of taking constructive feedback and using it? All of those pieces of social skills that really make cooperative learning a little different than just think, pair, and share for today. The last piece of cooperative learning that I'd really like you to think about and reflect upon it in your classroom is that face-to-face interaction piece. So often we have students sitting in front of their Chromebook or in front of their screen, or we have them working as partners side by side. In those situations, they don't have the opportunity to actually look at the faces of the people that they're working with. They don't have the opportunity to see someone's eyes or to be able to read how they're feeling. Communication skills is a big part of social emotional learning, and being able to pick up on nonverbal cues from those around you is a skill that we can actually teach students. So we encourage you to start placing your students in circles and across from each other so that they can look at each other's faces. And so often as a teacher I would say to my kids, well, she's the one answering, look at her face, so that you could read how that student was feeling about that. Are they passionate? Do they not care? Do they have personal investment in what their answer is? Those face-to-face interactions that we encourage with students really start helping hone and develop some of those nonverbal communication skills that we want. The last piece of teacher planning that we want to talk about in terms of our 5 SEL practices, and now you're all counting off and saying, oh, those were the 5, is classroom discussion. Classroom discussion is a huge integral piece that allows students to really start to bone up on some of their social emotional skills. If you've read any of the work of John Hattie, Invisible Learning, and he set that bar for what we think is effective practice at that 0.39 or 0.4, classroom discussion actually rated at a 0.82, which means that it is twice as effective in getting students to improve their academic achievement. And by the way, it is a huge component and proponent of social emotional learning as well. So we want to encourage different ways for kids to talk with each other. Some of those may include practices like inner outer circle, just to start kids thinking about what does it look like. So I put half the class facing out in a circle, half the class facing them. Ask questions, let them process, and then either move the inner or outer circle so that now they have a different partner to speak to. Give them some good questions and you can stand right in the middle to monitor the progress around the circle. This starts that ball rolling so that kids start to learn how to speak with each other. From there you can go to bigger, more advanced classroom discussions like fishbowl or Socratic seminar or any of those strategies that really allow for that rich discussion and analysis. Those conversations, again, face-to-face, picking up cues from each other, building on your communication skills, all of that strengthens the social emotional learning and practice that's happening in your classroom. At this point, I'm going to ask you to take a break. Talk about those 5 practices. What are the things you're already putting into place? What are the things you think you could add to help bolster some of those practices in your classroom, and recommendations that you would make for the other teachers that you work with? And we will see you back in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back. So now those of you who said, I didn't choose those 5, I had a few other, here you go, the winner is, all 10 are actually practices that promote social emotional learning. So even if you hadn't chose those 5 as your top 5, I really only grouped them together because it made sense in my moral mind that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that's how it makes sense for you, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's your priority or where you see that natural fit. So please use any of the 10 in the way that makes best sense for your classroom and your practice. We're going to continue on with the discussion of the last 5, and we are going to focus first on student-centered practices. And this is that idea of handing even more onus back over to the kids so that their community and their learning kingdom becomes important to them. The first piece we want to talk about is that student-centered discipline. I always think about the fact that I don't want to ever be the teacher in a faculty meeting whose administrator calls her out publicly in front of everybody. So if your behavior had to be admonished in any way, because let's face it, we've all done things wrong, we've all done things that we wish we had done a little bit differently, I wouldn't want to be called out publicly in front of my peers. And in the same way, I ask you to think about that in terms of the discipline that we use with our students. How much of it is public? How much of it is possibly embarrassing for our students? If we're looking at a student-centered discipline model, we're looking at a model that actually teaches kids what the correct behavior is. If your plan is to just band-aid the behavior, then there's many things you can do. But if you really want to modify, change, and teach behavior, it's that student-centered model that we really want to focus on. I find that pulling that student aside when there's a quiet moment and they've calmed and I've calmed and they're no longer in the hot state and I'm no longer in the hot state, those are the moments that can actually change behavior. I can have a student reflect on, what did you do? How did it affect others? How did it affect me? And let's talk about what you could do differently next time. That doesn't mean it doesn't come with consequences, because as you know, every choice we make has some consequences. But we also want to keep it focused on the fact that we really want to teach students what the correct behavior is, why, and what they can do the next time to improve those choices. The second piece we want to talk about in terms of student-centered practices is responsibility and choice. And sometimes when we look at a student's day, so much of it is completely out of their control. They have no choice on what subject they're going to take, what order they're going to learn it in, who they have to sit next to, even sometimes what they're going to eat for lunch. They have very little choice about what's going to happen within their day. And we know as educators, we hate when someone says to us, you have no choice, you must teach it this way, with fidelity, and those kind of statements. And we feel like, you're challenging the best parts of me. Let me show you what my strengths are as an educator. In the same way, we want students to be able to shine and show us what their best strengths are as students. So giving them some choice when we can, and allowing them to take some personal ownership of some of their learning. One of the strategies that I have done in the past 10 years that really has changed my practice, not only in my classroom, but at home with my husband and children, is the way in which I deliver choices to my kids, whether it be my students or with my spouse. So statements such as, you may choose either to do this or this. The reality is this, when you give kids choices like that, you have to make sure that you can live with either one of the choices. Are you okay if they choose A or B? Number 2, you have to make sure that both choices get the job done. So I can't ever say to a kid, you can do it now or you can do it later, because every student on the face of the earth is going to choose later, and then what are you going to do with them for the next half an hour? So you want to make sure that these two choices are really valid choices. Either one gets the job done, and I can live with either choice. So for example, in one classroom, a student was told you could either do your ELA now or you could do your math now. Which do you choose? And she said, I'm going to eat my broccoli first. And I thought, she's eating broccoli, that wasn't a choice. Her teacher explained to me that for her, math was broccoli. Get it out of the way, get it over with. And you know that some kids will choose that. Let's rip the Band-Aid off and get done with that first, as opposed to making that other choice first. So that's the first part of my choices. The next one is giving it to the student in such a way that they actually have to answer. So often we will go over to a group of students and say, okay, Carol, you can either stay here and continue to work with your partner, or you can choose to go work over there. Which do you choose? And Carol looks at you, shrugs, and gets back to work. And we accept that as an answer. But I'm going to ask you to actually ask your child for an answer. No, I'd like you to say, Let Carol make the choice. I'm choosing to stay here. Great. We want kids to start to make those connections between making a choice and understanding that there's a consequence. The last piece of it is, after Carol has made that choice and said, I'm choosing to stay here, you are going to reinforce that choice. So, Carol, you're choosing to stay here and work appropriately with your partner. Awesome. And walk away. At that point, Carol has made a choice. She's verbalized it. You've reinforced that you've given her the choice and the onus is in her hands. At that point, if Carol makes a choice and her behaviors tend to stray away from what you had intended in that group work, you can approach her and say, I'm so sorry, Carol. We tried your choice, and unfortunately it's not working out. Now can you move to this area so that you can work alone and complete this project? In that moment, you're saying to the student, I gave you authentic choice. You made a choice, and here's the consequence. In a lot of cases, you may find that the choice you're giving them, they make a wise choice. I had one classroom where we had to move classrooms. The light ballast blew when we were moving classrooms. And as we walked into the room, my itchiest student, and you know who he is, started heading right to the back. And he said, can we choose where we sit? And I said, yes, but you need to make a wise choice. And he turned right back around and moved to the front. And I said, thank you for making that good choice. That's after repeated patterns of me allowing him to make a choice and then learn from those consequences. So just to reiterate the pattern, give them a true, honest, authentic choice. You can live with either one, and either one gets the job done. You actually make the student respond and give that verbal, yes, I choose this. Then you reinforce that choice. So you're choosing, and those words are so critical, so you're choosing to do such and such. Thank you, and walk away. Hopefully you don't have to go back. They made a good choice. You allowed them to modify their behavior a little bit, and you're all set. If, unfortunately, you do have to go over, at least you can say, we tried it your way. I gave you the choice. This is the consequence, and now we're going to do it this way. One thing I really want to caution you about whenever we talk about choice is saying things like, you can either do it my way or my way. Because statements like that are not really authentic, true choices for students. And they're not really teaching students how to self-manage their behavior, which is one of the things we're going to be looking for as a competency in our students. We know as adults we have to be able to self-manage, and that's really the goal of part of the education that we're giving our students. The last student-centered practice that I'd really like you to think about is that self-reflection and self-assessment. How often do we ask students to really look at their practice, their behaviors, and think about it? Not when they're in the moment, but after the fact, when they're calm and that neocortex is firing in all cylinders and they can actually think. We can ask them to do that about behavior. We can ask them to do that about academics. I often think about when I got back a really bad test, the first thing I'd want to do is hide it and never look at it again. And what research shows is that kids will just pick the wrong answers over and over again if we never force them to actually look at those answers because they look familiar. So they'll fail it 5 times in a row. What I'm asking you to do is give your students some opportunity to reflect not only on their achievement academically, but to really reflect on their behavior. What are the things I'm most proud of today? How did I help the classroom today? How did I hinder the classroom today? What have I done to support the community? Have I acted kind today? Have I been empathetic to anybody? Those are the skills we want students to start reflecting on, as well as homework and quizzes and academic practice. But we want them to really start reflecting on who they are in terms of building those social emotional skills. The last set of practices we want to talk about all relate to setting the bar for our students. And the first one that we're going to look at is that academic press and expectations, and really setting that bar high for all of our students. Now, keeping in mind that what high looks like is going to be different for every student in your classroom, I completely understand, and it is a very difficult job to constantly differentiate to meet them at their needs. But to know that all students, no matter how challenged they may be academically or behaviorally, need to have that bar set nice and high, so that students know we have high expectations for what your behavior is going to be like, as well as academics, and not being afraid to ask kids to rise up to that expectation. When we look at respectful tasks for kids, instead of, if everyone in the classroom is jumping rope, just setting the rope on the floor and saying, you can just step over that, and actually setting that bar behaviorally and academically high for students. It actually supports that social emotional growth. And the last one we're going to be looking at is that competence building. So we really want to look at not only that integration, because this is practice-based, but really looking at explicit instruction of some of these skills. If kids are undertaking a task and you're seeing that they're having kind of struggles as they complete it, stopping and explicitly teaching some of those skills. Taking 20 minutes to teach a conflict resolution lesson. Taking 20 minutes to teach what active listening looks like or constructive feedback and how to communicate with one another. Having explicit moments where we focus on teaching those social emotional skills. So my friends, as you can see, all 10 practices actually promote social emotional learning in a classroom. The question is, of those 10, which are you most comfortable? Where do you think your strengths are? As you look at them, which are the ones that you think, I already do that, I've got those. But which are the ones that give you a little bit of a challenge that you think you could build in? Are you looking at classroom discussion in a little different way? Are you thinking, geez, I could do a little inner outer circle just to set a lesson one day and see where they are, and then I could close the day with it as well to see how much they've learned? Are you looking at things like balanced instruction? Could you use your phone, if your administrator allows it, or a stopwatch to try to see how much am I talking versus how much are the kids talking in my classroom? As you look at that list, I really would like you to star those ones you think you got, and then maybe put some asterisks next to the ones that you think you want to work on a little bit more this year. Keep in mind these are just practices that promote it. We also have explicit instruction, other things, school-wide practices, classroom practices, all kinds of things we're going to build into your whole social emotional program. But this is just one way to get you started on this road towards greater social emotional learning in your classrooms. So take a few minutes to talk about your strengths and your possible lesser strengths and where you think you want to go this year. Thank you for thinking about your strengths in that way. And I'm going to ask you to take a little bit further. We're actually going to look at the 5 competencies within social emotional learning. And we're going to take some time to really figure out what are the ones that you feel really strong and what are the ones that maybe you don't feel as strong. Keep in mind, we are all works in progress. There are some days that I feel that I'm doing really well in self-management and other days that I think, wow, I could really bolster that practice a little bit for myself. It's very difficult for us to teach anything that we really don't own and assess for ourselves as well. You all know that after your first year of teaching anything, you feel like, wow, I know that so much better. So we really want you to start evaluating, where do you think your strengths are? And know that kids mirror whatever you put out. So if you're a little uncomfortable in one of these areas, perhaps social awareness, eventually kids are going to pick up on that from you. So what are the ways that you could bolster your own social awareness skills as well, and your own social awareness learnings as well? We're going to take a few minutes to complete a self-evaluation. This evaluation is available on CASEL's website, and your moderator will have copies for you to complete. It's going to take you a few minutes to do an honest assessment and self-reflection of where you think you land in each one of the competencies. It's for no one but you to look at and reflect on where you think your strengths and lesser strengths lie. So take a few minutes to complete that activity. Thank you for completing that evaluation. I hope it gave you some things to really think about as we move forward with this work. The next modules are all based on each competency. So eventually we will be hitting your strengths and your lesser strengths as we travel this journey together. For our objectives today, this is where we were headed. Taking a look at social emotional learning in your particular school environment, reviewing the research that actually supports SEL programs, starting to look at the types of learners that benefit, and hopefully by now you're saying all learners, and then really looking at some of the practices that promote SEL along with that explicit instruction and integration in those pieces. And lastly, really starting to reflect on where you feel your competencies lie within social emotional learning. I'm going to leave you with 3 questions that I'd like you to talk about as your group today. First, are there areas of personal strength that could be shared with your students or colleagues to help develop a more positive SEL climate? Second, are there areas of personal challenge that you could identify as needing more resources or strategies to work on? Do you know where your weaknesses are? Do you know there are things that you really want to work on for yourself this year? And it may not be tied to academics, and that's okay. Lastly, which of the 10 practices could best be modified for use in your classroom immediately? Which ones can you take and start running with tomorrow, just with maybe a little tweak? We're going to take a few minutes to really look at this as a group, possibly in pairs or bigger groups, to think about how you're going to start to integrate some of this information into your plan right away. Okay, so we have to have the final closure because it increases retention and it makes the learner summarize what's been learned, all that lesson design stuff. So let's take a look at today's final closing statement. And your moderator can use them in whatever way they want, your administrator, your building, but this is the statement I'm really going to ask you to finish for today. When I used to think about social emotional learning in my classroom, I would think blank, but now I know blank. I know it's very similar to Match Game for those of you old enough to remember Match Game. What I'd like you to do is for everybody to complete one of these statements, share them out loud with the group, and perhaps even write them out so that you can post them, so that we can refer to them module after module or month after month, depending how you're doing these modules, so that you can really think about the growth that's going to take place over the next few months. We will see you with Module 2, Parts A and B, very shortly. Take care.